have everybody here. Welcome, my name is Diane Proctor, and I will serve as our moderator this evening. For those joining us on Zoom, and there will be, please keep your computer on mute throughout the presentation and use the chat box at the bottom of your screen to ask questions of our speakers. Fred Van Dusen, Fred, stand up and wave, our fantastic leader. Our fantastic leader, Reclaim Our Democracy, and dear friend, will be skillfully monitoring the chat box and parlaying your questions to the speakers. For those in the hall, Ray Andrews, Ray, raise your hand. Ray will be passing around a portable microphone to help you in the audience address questions after each of our guests has spoken in their entirety, and then we'll entertain questions. We will hear first briefly from Paul Langston Daly, First Parish's Minister of Social Action. Paul?
Wow, look at you all. Welcome to our first ever Democracy Festival. As Diane said, I'm Reverend Paul Langston Daly, and I am the Minister of Social Action here at First Parish in Concord. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight, and for those of you that are on Zoom for taking the time to be with us. And I hope that you'll join us for the festival tomorrow. We understand it's going to rain. It'll probably be the only rainy day in the whole month. But we're all set to move things indoors, and if you'll notice, there's little signs around that kind of indicate where things are going to be. So I hope you'll take some time tomorrow to come and join us during the day between 11 and 2 to come talk with our folks with our booths. This weekend's events are sponsored by the First Parish Social Action groups, all of us, by Reclaim Our Democracy, and by the Unitarian Universalists for Social Justice, which is a national organization, their Democracy in Action team. So, for those of you that are not familiar with Unitarian Universalism, I just want to give you a quick little picture of who we are. We center our values in love. That's the center of all that we do. And we recognize our interdependence and that we exist within a complex web of relationships and interconnections. We declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness, and we support the use of inclusive democratic process in decision-making. And that's part of why we're here tonight, because this issue of democracy and saving our democracy is a central value to us as people of faith. This weekend, we're taking a few moments to address the fact that our democracy is indeed in peril. And if you're not sure that that's true, please open a newspaper and turn on the news. There are forces that are seeking to bring about this sort of illiberal democracy that we keep hearing about, or for those of you that are kind of attuned to what's happening in Europe. And it's a place where freedom is limited, right? Where anyone outside those stated norms, whatever those stated norms are forced to hide or face violence. It's a place where journalism is confined to the party line and competition is marginalized or even jailed. I don't want that here in the United States. I don't think you do either. So we are in Concord, Massachusetts, one of the central places where our nascent democracy was nurtured. And this weekend, we celebrate this imperfect but vital form of government with this Democracy Festival. We want to continue to nurture and celebrate our civic society, our engagement in things that matter, our real and deep belief that we are all connected, and that all people, each and every single one of us, without exception, has inherent dignity and worthiness. Every single one of us. We're pleased to have you all here this evening and to offer this opportunity to reflect on the state of our democracy and on the ways in which we can work together to save it. So again, thank you all for coming. I hope that you will join us tomorrow between 11 and 2. And now I will give the microphone back to Diane, and she will introduce you to our guests.
I think you can tell he's a minister, can you not? Okay. And now to the business of the evening. I wish to make a public confession. I am addicted to listening to and reading about politics. I read the Times, the Washington Post, the Globe, Heather Cox Richardson during the day, and then I plug into Ezra Klein in the evening before I sleep and follow Pod Save America and Pod Save the World with zeal into the early hours of the morning, plugged into my ears. My beloved husband, who sits right over there, on the other hand, my beloved husband, while an ardent member of the Democratic Town Committee, does not. He reads selectively, and then gardens, carves gorgeous birds, and immerses himself in music. We both share and care deeply each other's passions, support them, and respect our differences. So, why do I proffer this confession? Because it is democracy at work. Mutual respect, careful listening, and generous support create a flourishing democracy in our home. Thus, when we ask the question this evening, democracy for whom and why, I declare that creative democracy can thrive all about us if we simply observe and temper our daily comportment and interactions with each other. There is a paradox, however. In a time when not all houses, and here I emphasize houses with a capital H, you know, the kind of, so you all know what I mean, right? Okay. Are quiescent, well, not all, are quiescent and respectful. We hear the word democracy indicted as a partisan notion, or as a singular domain of one side or the other. That's ridiculous. Democracy is central to the vitality of our country. But to parse this paradox, tonight we have 4 experts who are going to speak to us about their encounters with and support of democracy. I will provide a brief introduction to each speaker as they begin. But first, I suspect you have noticed that the program of speakers has changed. We still have Danielle Allen. And Jim Tall. As promised. But Shanique Spalding will be speaking in Tanisha Sullivan's place. Tanisha had an unexpected business trip. And Irene Koval, Irena, if I were doing it properly, Irena Koval is standing in for her friend and countrywoman, Tanya Lipinski, who has come down with COVID. I mean, tell me that it's over. It's not over. And we send her, obviously, our very best wishes. Our first speaker tonight is Danielle Allen. Danielle is a professor of public policy, politics, and ethics at Harvard University, and a James Bryant Conan University professor, one of Harvard's highest honors. She came to those positions after earning 5.8 at Princeton in classics, and a doctorate from King's College, Cambridge in classics. And I confess that I didn't really understand the connection between public policy and classics as richly as when I read her most recent book, in which that intellectual and verbal connection becomes so rich. And a second doctorate, of course, because why not? A second doctorate in government from Harvard. After winning a MacArthur Genius Grant in 2001, she soon garnered an appointment as a professor of social science at the impressive Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. And while chairing the Pulitzer Prize Committee and the Mellon Foundation Board of Trustees, she received the prestigious, I have it right here. She received the prestigious, oh, I know, this page has to turn the other way. She received the prestigious Klug Award from the Library of Congress, where she was recognized for her wisdom and influence in the study of the humanities and described as she is as a national treasure. Her academic plaudits, therefore, are many, but we cherish our Danielle Allen, Massachusetts Danielle Allen, as a person who made history as the first Black woman ever to run for statewide office. As her recent opinion pieces, which I hope you've all read, and the Washington Post suggest, Danielle hopes to drive our country towards a new social contract that serves and includes us all. Of her many books, the widely acclaimed Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in Defense of Equity, stands as a testament to her commitment to our country's children, citizens, and philosophical foundations. And as does her newest work, and I think it's here someplace, I saw somebody holding it up, as Justice, thank you, my dear, Justice by Means of Democracy. Not for the faint of heart, but an extraordinary work. Thank you very much. Welcome, Danielle, and thank you.
Up here or do you want to stand there? Do you guys want to be up here or at the podium? I think I'll go to the podium if you're okay with it. Okay.
You're gonna come down here?
Yep.
Fantastic.
Few remarks. Diane, you said you were confessing something, but we all know you're addicted to politics. That was no confession, my friend. It's such a pleasure to be here. I love being here. I've had the chance to speak in this beautiful church a few other times, and I so appreciate the depth of your commitment to democracy, the fact that you gather and you're growing bigger in your gathering to do work for democracy. I'll just be very brief because there are four of us and we want to hear from everybody. You've all heard me tell stories before. I'm from people who have loved and fought for democracy for generations. So I always invoke my granddad, who helped found one of the first NAACP chapters in northern Florida in the 40s. And I don't know how well you know northern Florida, but it's basically the state of southern Georgia. So it was really tough times. On my mom's side, my great-grandparents helped fight for women's right to vote. And my great-grandmother was president of the League of Women Voters in Michigan in the 30s. And we're all historians in my family, so I have her little sort of pocket-sized rules of order. I should bring this to the meetings in June. Mrs. Emma Cox's rules of order,
Oh my God.
if you know those. So, at any rate, I'm grateful to have come up in a context among people with a family who cared deeply about democracy, saw its value in empowerment, in the foundation that the chance to steer your own life gives to everybody, to bring a sense of empowerment and flourishing to individuals, families, and communities. And for me, honestly, I took it all for granted until my own generation was coming up in the world. My parents' generation all pretty much moved up. My granddad was a fisherman, kids were small business owners and professors, and on the other side, factory worker and then accountants. So everybody came up, but my generation has been different. My generation has lived through what I call the great pulling apart. So I am fortunate to have this amazingly privileged role at Harvard. I have a brother who's a corporate executive, but I also have cousins who aren't with us any longer. And for terrible reasons, substance use disorder, homicide. It was really losing my youngest cousin in 2009. It was just a life turning point moment for me and put me in a space where what I wanted to do was figure out, well, how could this democracy thing not just be abstractly good, but actually empower, let us steer our own lives, and really give us the chance, the tools to solve our problems so that generations can come up together, can come up in the world, all thriving, moving forward. So I dug in the first instance to justice reform work. I quickly learned that even where there were bipartisan solutions to things, you couldn't get them through because of our degree of governance dysfunction. And so for me, my red alert for the state of our democracy came in 2013 when Congress had an approval rating of 9%. And I was thinking, this is, we've got to really take that in because House of Representatives, that's the first branch of government that's supposed to be the people's voice. So if we, the people, approve of our own voice at a rate of 9%, we're a self-hating people. And that's a bad place to be. It's bad for mental health. It's bad for our capacity to function with each other. You sort of just go down the list. And so I always have that in mind when I look at the situation we have now, where things are profoundly worse than they were even a decade ago. And for me, the single worst thing in our current moment, which is not actually going to be what you think, I'm not actually going to say Trump, and I'm not actually going to say January 6th. The single worst thing for me is how young people in our democracy feel about our democracy. All right? So, when you look across generations, in the boomer generation, about 73% of boomers feel proud to live in America. Gen X, 53%. So it kind of goes, millennials, 36%. Gen Z, 16%. And similarly, if you ask the question whether people consider it essential to live in a democracy, about 70% for folks born before World War II, and then it comes down for folks under 40 to not quite 30% consider it essential to live in a democracy. So I see us as having a kind of fundamental job to do to achieve generational succession for our democracy. And for me, there are two parts of that. Civic education is a huge part of that. I do a lot of civic education work, rebuilding civic education in our schools. But the truth is, we cannot win the affection of young people for our democracy if our democracy is broken. You just can't do it. So if you care about civic education, if you want young people to learn and to reconnect to democracy, then we also actually have to invite them into something worth their time. So that's on us, and we have to figure out how to drive renovation in the institutions of our democracy so that they actually function, that there's a political culture that's worth participating in. It's a big job. We're better off in many ways in Massachusetts than other places, but we have work to do here too. We have below average voting registration rates for communities of color. We have huge disparities in participation between white voters and suburban voters and communities of color in the Commonwealth. We have the most restrictive candidate ballot access requirements in the country. And we too have news deserts that mean that people aren't in a position to see and shape what's going on in their own local community. So we have a lot to do. But what do we need nationally that Massachusetts can help with? Nationally, we need to take power out of the hands of the people who participate in party primaries. I hate to say that because all of you do too. Okay? But the truth of the matter is, this is what has locked us into dysfunction. Majority of Americans want gun control. Why can't we get it? Because party activists, the Republican Party, control who's in Congress, control the dynamics of what's operating in Congress. We can't get it. Abortion, same sort of thing. Public opinion is in one place, the dynamics in Congress are in another place. This is directly flowing from the fact that so many elections are decided in primaries. Marjorie Taylor Greene was elected by just 8% of the electorate in her district. Okay? So here in Massachusetts, although we don't feel bad about this fact, right, that we get a lot done in our primaries, we could actually help unlock the problem for the whole country if we use the same model we use for municipal elections for our state and federal elections. So forget about party primaries, have an all-comers preliminary. People can still run with party labels. Parties can still work. They can still identify their endorsed candidate. They can do grassroots work and build strength. But they do that trying to win support from the whole electorate. That's the key. Put parties back in the business of trying to earn support from the whole electorate, not just activate over and over again the same base, try to keep that base engaged. Grow support. That's what we need parties to do. And for parties to work on growing support, they've got to actually campaign to the whole electorate at every step of the way. So take that model from our municipals where we have top two, we get all-comers preliminary finalists. We can use that statewide, federal races as well. Maybe use top 4, top 5 finalists like Alaska with their important recent renovation and reform. And if we do that, we start putting the hands back in, or the power back in all of our hands. We'll start having functional governance. We'll have something that we can connect kids to with confidence, knowing that they can actually get something done in a working system. So I'm going to be back to you to talk more about this idea. I'm just wanting to share it with you now. I think it's a really important renovation we could lead on in Massachusetts and set a model for the country and try to change the dynamics for the whole country. Thanks a lot.
Passing microphones around. Thank you, Danielle, and inspiration for all of us. Shunique Spalding is the Executive Director of Massachusetts Voters' Rights Table. which is obviously so centrally connected to the question of democracy, is it not, a voters' rights table? She is a political, social, and reproductive justice activist who has dedicated nearly a decade to organizing in BIPOC communities across Massachusetts. With a BS in criminal justice from Mount Ida College, Shanique is a native of Kingston, Jamaica, and is a current resident of Springfield, which I just have to say she drove from tonight after helping her beloved father get settled in hospital. I mean, that she's come this far and done this is just remarkable. So. She brings her lived experiences and passion for uplifting and finding justice for marginalized communities like her own to work. In 2022, Shanique delivered a hard-fought win for the Fair Share Amendment campaign as the BIPOC community director. Prior to the Fair Share campaign, Shanique spent 4.5 years, or 4+ years, with Planned Parenthood in the Advocacy Fund of Massachusetts, working on reproductive rights and justice issues in Western and Central Massachusetts. As the manager, not working. Oh, well, that's terrific. Thank you, Fred. As the manager and manager of mobilization and BIPOC organizing, her life has been spent giving to issues about which she cares and making a difference. It is a privilege to have her here tonight.
How's everyone doing? Yeah, energy. I'm an organizer. I'm gonna hold the mic here because I'm a yeller. Also, 4 years in theater. So I'm feeling right at home. Thank you so much, Diane, for sharing a little bit about who I am. So, as Diane mentioned, I am the executive director for the Massachusetts Voter Table, which is a table basically focused on civic engagement and also making sure that people have access to the ballot box. We work statewide, so we do have an office in Boston, but we are working statewide. We have over 50 organizations, mostly grassroots, small organizations, some of them faith-based as well, that are part of our table because they believe that civic engagement and access to voting rights is important for our democracy. So they have all joined the table, and we, as the Massachusetts Voter Table, my small team of 6, work on making sure that grassroots organizations have the tools and the resources and funding as well to do civic engagement work in their own communities and regionally. So we have folks all the way over to Western Mass, all the way to the South Shore, Merrimack Valley, Central Mass area, working in mostly BIPOC and low-income communities, so very much like our gateway cities, doing this work. I want to start with just sort of like how I came into this work and why democracy is so important to me. So as Diane shared in my bio, I'm originally from Kingston, Jamaica. And I always start there in my story because coming to this country for opportunities is part of the immigration story for many. But what's unique about our stories is that we have to work towards access to the ballot box. So I became a naturalized citizen just before senior year of high school. And so I became a naturalized citizen as I was exiting senior year of high school. And so my first vote ever was for Barack Obama while in college, so you're welcome, America. And even then I knew, because I immigrated at age 7 to this country, to Springfield. But then I knew what a monumental moment that was, and how much that mattered in the history of democracy in America. And I was deeply moved. I remember crying my first 4th of July as a citizen, a naturalized citizen, thinking about what it means to be an American and to be a part of the fabric of this nation with everything that I am. And I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. I'm gonna say that. So no disrespect to my lawyers. But I thought I wanted to be a lawyer for a long time, and I chased that dream, right? That was what I was gonna do. But in between, I kept volunteering on campaigns. The following year, even when I became a naturalized citizen on campus, I was running voter registration drives on campus, was helping other students to vote absentee as well in their states. I was doing that on campus, and then I also did an internship for Deval Patrick for his re-election campaign. Then I left college, I lived in Malden, looking for a job in a law firm, and decided to return home for another job opportunity. And while there, I met Elizabeth Warren for her first run. You feel me? I love the that came out of you, because that's exactly how I felt. But I met Elizabeth Warren and volunteered on her first election campaign for Senate. And it was in a church very much like this in downtown Springfield, First Church, which also is a historic church in our community, with so many people in that space. I remember standing in a line all the way back to the highway, having conversations with people in a line that I had never met before from all parts of Western Mass. And then the church was so packed that they started to put speakers and chairs outside. That's how many people were there. And it was because I was volunteering in a campaign that one of the organizers saw me and was like, "Come on in, Shanique, I'll squeeze you into the pews." And I went in there, and it was the most moving experience for me. And I remember how I felt to be in a room with folks who were so aligned in what they believed in and what they wanted for the future and what they wanted for representation. I remember burly guys from the carpenters unions up top in their shirts. I remember standing on a stage with Deval Patrick, Black leaders from our community that had been leaders even in the civil rights movement, members of the Democratic Party, and we had our Black president and our Black governor, and I just saw myself in politics, and I was deeply moved, and I thought, man, if I do anything in my life, I want to do something that makes me feel like this moment. And so I went off to intern for Elizabeth Warren because I was curious about what they do once they got elected. I interned for Congressman Neal as well, and I was recommended by Congressman Neal's district director for a position at the Democratic Party as a community of color organizer. What did I know about organizing? Absolutely nothing. I came all the way to Boston to interview and ended up getting that position. And I decided to leave my stable job to do this work, and the work has held me for all those years. And then I worked for Ed Markey. And then I got tired because I thought, surely I need to take a break and get a real job at a 9-to-5 and return back to studying for the LSAT. And I wanted to tell that part of the story because I did campaign after campaign. I worked on a ballot initiative as well, which was interesting. The first minimum wage campaign, the first time the Raise Up Coalition became a thing. So I then went to work for the YWCA of Western Mass in development. And I was still working my 9-to-5, but from 5 to 10, I was on Democratic city committees. I was knocking doors for candidates. I was helping people in Western Mass run for office because there weren't that many people who had the same skills as me to help run strategy to run their very first campaign. So I was doing that because I was flirting with politics. But my realization that democracy was at stake was sort of what had happened for a lot of people, was in 2016 when Trump got elected. And it wasn't simply that he got elected because I saw that coming. I saw the deterioration of the Republican Party when the Tea Party became a thing. So I wasn't shocked when he was elected. But what happened when he got elected was what he tried to do to good policies that had existed in place. And for me, one of those was the rolling back of Title IX funding, the protections for survivors of sexual assault on campus, and also the same protections around protecting against education discrimination, and how that impacted the women in our shelters at the YW. And I realized in that moment that I loved my job and I deeply cared about my friends and colleagues that worked in service. But I realized I didn't want to be at the end of when everything and every system had failed people. I wanted to be at the beginning, stopping those things from happening and creating good policies that when bad things happen to everyday people, that government can help, that policies, our elected officials, the people around them, and community was stronger and could support them in that time. I did not see that happening at the YW, and I did not see that happening. And so I decided I was going to be an organizer. Probably not work campaign after campaign, and that's how I ended up at the YWCA of Western Mass, at Planned Parenthood Advocacy Fund. And I spent 4.5 years working in repro during the Trump administration. And I will say, thank you. I would say that is when I fell in love with every UU church and the way that they view politics and how deeply engaged they are in civic engagement after working with the UU church pastors in Worcester. And Reverend Payson, to be exact. You know Reverend Payson? A love of my life. Reverend Payson and I fought a good battle for sexual health education in schools. And we could not have done it without the congregation and our faith leaders really stepping up in that community. But 4.5 years in repro was tough. There was a transition at Planned Parenthood, and there was a lot happening on the ballot campaigns, and that's how I jumped to Fair Share. And from there landed at the current position that I'm in. And it's kind of like life came full circle for me, because although I was working on issue politics, working in BIPOC and low-income communities, it had always been about how do we empower, uplift those communities to engage in this process. So what am I seeing as a problem in democracy right now? And what I'm seeing in a problem in democracy in our state, and what my organization is trying to do now, is to get people civically engaged. We are seeing people less and less engaged in a political process. And it is terrible. And so when you ask democracy for who, it's really the things that Danielle is talking about. It's about the people who vote in primaries. It's about wealthy, affluential communities having the power to elect people. So although we are in Massachusetts and we have Democrats, but they're the Democrats for who? Representing which people? We cannot get anything passed in the State House, and I should know for working so long on Beacon Hill. We can't get anything passed unless we run a ballot campaign. Have you noticed the last few years, the most progressive things we've done, we've passed through a ballot initiative? Do you know how expensive it is to run a ballot campaign? So even our grassroots organization may want to work on an issue. They need the power of unions and big, wealthy organizations like Planned Parenthood to be a part of the fight to even run a ballot campaign. And although we have been successful at our ballot campaigns, that should not be the way democracy runs. We elect people for the people, by the people, right? We elect those people to represent our interests. All of these things we've run at ballot issues have been things that we've put in the State House to be passed. And for whatever which reason, we can't get it done. Healthy Youth Act has not been passed for over decades. There are children right now who, depending on what community they live in, will not get sexual health education. The basics of how their bodies work is not even a thing that some students have access to. When we think about who's voting in elections, last year we saw of the people that could vote, 50% of the population did not vote. And that was a midterm election. That was a statewide election year where we saw a significant drop in turnout. People are disengaged. When we look even closer to the communities that turned out, we saw that in certain communities like myself, where I live in Springfield, We were top 10 in the lowest voter turnout, number 2 of the lowest voter turnout. Worcester is on that as well. Pretty much all our gateway cities are not turning out. Their turnout levels last year was somewhere between 20 and 30%. When we look at wider, more affluential communities, and I use the word affluential because I want to make sure you understand these are people in a certain tax bracket. People who are low income experience the same things in the same communities with BIPOC folks and immigrant populations. They're experiencing the same disenfranchisement. And we saw that those communities turned out in 70%. So when you think about who got elected and how they got to where they got to, just know it was those people who elected them. And that might not reflect the community that you live in. That those might not be the leaders that you wanted. And then we find out that also on the ground, people are not aware elections are happening, aware of all the ways that they can vote, or where they can vote, or when they can vote. So we work at the Massachusetts Voter Table with grassroots organizations that are committed to this because the best messengers in communities are community organizations who simply do, and we're a C3 nonprofit organization, simply do voter education. It's an election this year. Here's everyone that's running. Here's where you can vote. Come to us, ask us if you have questions, if you need help getting to the polls. That's so critical now, because for me, I'm now seeing that it's not about the parties, and that seems to be a lot of what we hear in the national landscape, whether you're left or you're right. But more people are in the middle, and more people can't even choose if they're left or right if they don't even know an election is happening. How do you know how you want to vote if you don't know you need to be voting? And we're relying too much on individual candidates and maybe sometimes our parties, right, doing the voter turnout and voter education in communities, which shouldn't be all of the work that they do. It should not rest on the few organizers. I am one of few in Western Mass, let alone Berkshire County, to think about that. So I just wanted to just name that civic engagement is important in the solving of this problem. And I think that centering community when we think about how we solve the issues of democracy is so core to the solutions that we all want to see.
Clearly that makes a difference. Thank you so very, very much. Irina Koval brings us a perspective from the front lines of the fight for democracy, Ukraine. She has a distinguished background. She served as the BBC Ukraine freelance journalist in Kiev. She is the author of 2 plays, The Lion and the Lioness, produced at the National Theatre in Kiev, that ran for 5 years. And I love this one, The Marinated Aristocrat. I really want to see this. A British-Ukrainian satire produced in Kiev, which ran for 13 years. As well, she wrote a novella called The Barefoot Ballerina, published in Kiev, and has written an autobiographical novel entitled Displaced, published in the US and Kiev. It is a privilege to welcome her to our platform, and her passion for the Ukraine has inspired many of us.
Thank you very much. I recently saw a letter to the editor that said, Ukraine is not America's problem. And so today I'd like to address what democracy means in Ukraine, in Russia, and how it impacts the rest of the world. My husband Ehud and I, Concordians since 1985, are the children of refugees who escaped Soviet paradise during World War II and became the proud citizens of Great Britain and the United States. In 1993, my husband Ehud became CEO of the British company Imperial Chemical Industry in Kiev. 2 years prior, 92% of Ukrainians voted to become an independent nation. And here he was, 2 years later, trying to set up capitalism. Ivan and I spent 13 exciting years in Ukraine, living in Kiev, taking part in a fledgling democracy that was being born. Ivan demonstrated how to do business without taking or giving bribes, and taught his employees how to pay taxes. My 2 plays were produced at the National Theatre and Molody Theatre with audiences watching in disbelief at new ideas. A parliament was formed, newspapers began reporting facts, people were free to worship, and with some trepidation began to question, discuss, and argue. With Soviet propaganda dead, the challenge was to figure out how to live and what to believe. Ukrainians were discovering that 300 years of servitude and Russian chauvinism had robbed them of their cultural identity. They began examining their history and the Soviet lies that had been fed. They began probing Stalin's murders of Ukrainian artists, poets, writers, theater directors. They began looking into the man-made Holodomor, an artificial death by hunger orchestrated by Stalin, in which 4 million people were starved to death. Ukrainians had chosen its direction towards Europe and were creating a new generation. But democracy demanded participation. And in the Orange Revolution of 2004, which my husband and I participated in, Ukrainians revolted against the manipulation of ballot voting in a rigged election and the poisoning of the presidential candidate Yushchenko. In 2014, in the Revolution of Dignity, they rose against President Yanukovych after he promised to sign an association agreement with the European Union and sold them down the river to Russia. In the march of millions, 500,000 Ukrainians came from all over the country to march in Kiev. And for 3 months of brutal, often sub-zero temperatures, the people protested in Kiev's central plaza, the Maidan. As 4,000 Berkut police attacked them, the bells of St. Michael's Monastery rang an alarm for the first time in 800 years. Over 103 civilians were killed, 880 wounded. On February 22nd, Yanukovych fled and sought asylum in Russia. From February 27 to March 18, masked Russian troops without insignias seized the parliament of Crimea. By March 18, Russia had annexed Crimea. On April 7, Russia activists stormed government buildings in Donbass, an operation aimed at further thwarting Ukraine's independence. On February 24, 2022, the day Russia invaded Ukraine, Russian intelligence, as well as US agencies, were confident Ukraine would quickly collapse. How Ukrainians proved Russians and Americans wrong is a topic for many doctoral dissertations. Ukrainian democracy is a thorn in Putin's side. A free Ukraine does not fit with his plans for a great Russian empire. And so, since 2004, he stewed, he snorted, and devised a plan to destroy Ukraine once and for all. And today, Ukraine is the battleground on which Putin unleashes his humiliation and rage. Ukrainians are a bold, resilient people who will never return to a mythical empire. They'll pursue their own future of democratic self-determination. The United States, with the President Joe Biden at the helm, stands in solidarity with Ukraine, challenging a desperate megalomaniac who flagrantly shows his contempt for Western democratic values. The United States and its allies understand that through their military and humanitarian support, democracy will be victorious not only in Ukraine, but in all of the civilized world. Nearly 250 years ago, a battle for American independence was fought for the same ideals Ukraine is fighting today. President Zelensky, with his remarkable leadership, shows the same courage and determination the American militia exhibited in their struggle against British colonial rule. Putin's biggest fear is the spreading of democracy in Russia, which has regressed to its former Soviet state of terror. The Russian people are encouraged to report those who speak against the war to the authorities. Political opposition is destroyed. The media strangled. Television is the regime's weapon of war. The population has a make-believe idea that the West wants to destroy them, that they're compelled to sacrifice everything for victory. Intent on retaining power at all costs, Russia's autocrats have stolen the people's elections, their natural resources, and their psyche. Harvard professor Serhiy Plokhy, Ukraine's most noted historian, in his forthcoming book, The Russo-Ukrainian War, highlights the stark contrast between Russia's and Ukraine's experience of democracy. Russia's experiment with parliamentary democracy under Boris Yeltsin lasted little over 2 years, after which it became increasingly autocratic. 3 years after gaining independence, Ukraine achieved what Russia has never achieved: a transfer of presidential power through free and fair elections. Ukrainians have resoundingly rejected time and again the kind of populist and right-wing extremist movements that have gained popularity in some Western Ukraine, but West European countries and in the United States. Ukraine's commitment to pluralism, mutual cultural respect, presents a united stand for multi-ethnic, multi-religious solidarity in its vision for the future. For Ukraine to reach this level of democratic development since 1991 is a miracle. Despite insurmountable odds, hundreds of years of subjugation, millions of people murdered, sent to the gulags, the Ukrainian language forbidden by the czars, brainwashing in Ukrainian schools, where lessons conducted in Russian taught Russian superiority and Ukrainian Little Russian inferiority. In speeches all over the world, President Zelensky has exposed the massive war crimes the Russian army has committed in Ukraine and condemned Putin's continual terrorist bombings and missile strikes against civilian targets as I speak. In Zelensky's words, this war will define in what world our children and grandchildren will live, and then their children and grandchildren. The struggle will define whether our world will be a democracy for Ukrainians, for Americans, for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We sit here with such comfort, don't we? A loud noise doesn't cause us to run. We live in such really remarkable ease, and we know that it's being fought on another side. This whole purpose, this whole sense of democracy. Thank you, Irene, so much. We now bring Jim Tull. Jim brings us another critical international perspective on the struggle for democracy. Jim is a partner with the firm CM Partners and a globally recognized leader in the fields of negotiation, communication, and conflict management. He has advised and trained top-level executives and government officials in over 80 countries. With 25 years of professional experience designing and delivering highly tailored workshops and advising top-level executives, he works across a diverse range of international business sectors, including energy, technology, finance, pharmaceuticals, professional sports, and food production and distribution. His practice has led him to negotiations, to name just a few of his efforts, in Bolivia, Ghana, Nicaragua, Paraguay, and Venezuela. He works closely with myriad international organizations such as United Nations and UNICEF. Indeed, in the early email conversation that I had with Jim, he was in Bogota, Colombia. A close associate and friend of Professor Richard Fisher, who wrote Getting to Yes, which I suspect most in this audience have read. Jim is currently a member of the adjunct faculty for the Questrom School of Business at Boston University. A graduate of Kenyon College, Jim received his master's in public administration from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and sits on the board of the Harvard Kennedy School's New England Alumni Association. A member of our First Parish, we welcome Jim home. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you very much, and it is nice to not have to race from Western Massachusetts here, but just about a mile up the road. I could have walked here this evening, although I was supposed to be in Venezuela this week, and I would have arrived just in time. So Shanique, you and I would have had to have had words about who came farthest. I'm going to try to speak briefly because. If you're like me, it's been fascinating to listen to the three perspectives. I want to hear more, and I want to get to some questions and answers. So I'll just frame up a little bit about my perspective that I bring, which is slightly different than the others. Consistent, of course, but I work in international conflict management. A lot of what I'm doing these days in the political sphere is on democracies which are either failing or failed states, or democracies that are at risk of being taken over by autocratic regimes or autocratic leadership. I already mentioned Venezuela. I think many people would say that's an autocratic government, if not dictatorship. Working in Nicaragua, some would not. Yeah. I didn't mean to speak for everybody. And I should say that I happen to know Nicolas Maduro personally, so I don't want to sound like I'm bashing them, but I do know that there are a lot of perspectives out there that are challenged by the way that government has stayed in power. Nicaragua, same thing. A lot of but questions will be good in a little bit. The work in Nicaragua, likewise, they have done a lot of things over the last few years to make it very difficult for the opposition to run. In both countries, I work bilaterally whenever I can. In both countries, I'm trying to help the opposition get more organized about how they dialogue with one another. So this is where the conflict management and more appropriately negotiations, communications come in. Frankly, in a lot of democracies around the world, whether they're functioning or failing, the leadership has a habit of working through what Roger Fisher would have called positions, as opposed to underlying interests. And of course, we've seen that in the debt ceiling crisis here in our country over the last few weeks. people declare what their positions are over the media in front of the cameras. They don't necessarily talk about what the underlying interests are that have to be met. And that was really the groundbreaking work that Professor Fisher did and William Ury did in getting yes, was to say there's often a lot more that you can do if you can get to the underlying interests as opposed to the positions. I will say that in terms of coups or coup attempts or overthrows, I've lived through 4 of them now in my life. 5, if you count creatively. But the first one was when I was living in Nicaragua 30 years ago, and I was in post-war Nicaragua, but in the middle of a lot of different attempts to overthrow the government or to reverse some local or national policies. I was taken hostage there and had to negotiate my own release. That's how I got into this field accidentally. And later in Guatemala, I was there for what they call the autogolpe, which is self-coup, where the president basically just dissolved parliament, which in Guatemala was illegal. They just did it in Ecuador this week. I just got a series of texts from a lawyer friend of mine in Ecuador who's pointing out to me that there it's legal, it's part of the Constitution, they're allowed to do that, the president's allowed to do that. In Guatemala, it was not legal. They took over parliament. We found out in the remote village because you turn on the radio or news and you only get marimba music 24/7, and that's your clue that something bad has gone down in the capital city. Later, I was doing some work in Honduras, and there was an attempted uprising in the streets, and we were sort of sequestered out of there. And then the 4th one that I count is, I'm looking at my birthday buddy, Tom Wilson, January 6th, which is our birthday, not the same year, frankly. Tom's much younger and handsomer. January 6th, 2021, I will share that as soon as it happens, some of my friends here heard me say, this is an insurrection. I've seen this before, and there's no doubt in my mind. So I can talk if people want to hear more during the Q&A about what some of the signs or indicators are of insurrections, but it's kind of a playbook. And it's not that people who are in the insurrection have read the playbook, but it seems to be human nature that leads toward that sort of uprising in a number of different common things. So I mentioned there's maybe a 5th one, and that is in April 2002, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela was overthrown for a couple days. He was taken out of power and then brought back in a couple days later. I mention that because I was not in Venezuela. I was here in Massachusetts at the time. But about 4 months after that, I was involved in founding what is a group that's called the Boston Group, still exists today. It's bilateral groups, Chavistas and opposition members of parliament, called the Boston Group because their first meeting was out in Cape Cod. And they have been continuing their negotiations, their bilateral dialogue, their management and governance from behind the scenes for over 20 years. As far as I know, they're the only bilateral group of politicians in the world that's lasted in that way for that long. So I want to just make 3 quick points about this, and then, as I say, get back to the Q&A. First, democracy. It's fascinating, and the definition of it is not that complex, but I also find it not that compelling. Like, people don't pursue democracy because of the definition of it. So just my simplistic understanding of it, or what I keep in my head when I'm working with all these groups that say we want more democratic principles in our country, is a definition which just includes a list of agreements that we follow voluntarily. So ours, here in the US, the Constitution, Bill of Rights, Declaration. In other countries, they have very similar things. But the point is, if it's not voluntary, it's not going to work, right? So the autocratic regimes, the uprisings, tend to be a forceful attempt to impose one side's, always one side's, interests or views about what should be done, as opposed to bringing in incentives and motivating the populace to do what they should do. Now, of course, democracy involves the consent of the government to manage the country. So I throw that in there just to prove that I did get an A on the test in civics in 8th grade or whatever it was. But in practical terms, it has to be voluntary. All this stuff about democracy is fragile, I also wrote that in my test booklet. I didn't really understand it until I started to see a lot of these threats to democracy. I think we're all experiencing threats in different ways, not just here in the US, but around the world. But the natural response when people feel frustrated with a voluntary system is to start to impose. And I think that's one of the biggest dangers that we face around the world, is that people are fine with imposing their will on others. And it's not usually sustainable for a very long time. You gave us a very good description about why even Russia-Ukraine situation is a bit fragile. What we find in conflicts is that whenever one side imposes their will on another, there will be a reaction. Sooner or later, there will be a reaction. It's almost never sustainable indefinitely. There are a few examples people point to, but generally speaking, it has to be a voluntary system is the one that's going to sustain us. I want to talk about autocracies versus democracies, and I'm going to reference in particular Leopoldo Lopez. Some of you may know that name. He's a Venezuelan politician who is in the opposition. He's right now in exile in Spain. The reason is because he was the leading presidential candidate back in 2004, I believe it was, and he was put in jail. Now, interesting the way it happened. He was clearly the leader. He was leading a lot of street protests. He was popular with people throughout the capital, Caracas. And at some point, word came to him that they were going to put him in prison, as they had many of the other political leaders. And he said, nope, I believe in democracy. I have faith in our system. I'm going to continue with my democratic movement. So he dressed up in white shirt, white pants, as he often did for his demonstration, and he started walking down to the presidential palace through the streets of Caracas. And his plan was to just go to the president, Nicolas Maduro, and say, here I am, I understand you're looking for me. As he was marching down there, of course, his followers started to amass. By the time he got to the presidential palace, tens of thousands of people behind him. So somebody handed him a bullhorn, he stood on top of a car in a park across the street, made a few speeches, and then he put it down. He walked over to the police who were over on the sidelines of the protests and said, I know you're looking for me, here I am. They didn't know what to do. They sort of panicked about, if we take him under arrest now, we get mobbed. Eventually they did move him over to a corner of the park. They brought in a helicopter, took him out. He was put in prison and spent 7 years in solitary confinement and was eventually allowed to go to home arrest and moved to the Spanish embassy and eventually fled the country. I mention him because not only do I know Nicolas Maduro, the president, but I also know his archenemy, Leopoldo Lopez. He went to both Kenyon College and Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, so he and I connected around that. But I was with him and his family at this time last year at Kenyon College for the Leopoldo Lopez Award. We were honoring various Nicaraguan exiles who had been fighting for democracy. And he told a number of different stories, but the one piece of all his discussions that stood out to me was when he was talking to a young group of poli-sci students, political science students, all undergraduates, and a young woman of probably 19 or 20 years old said to him, I hear you and the Nicaraguans talking about how your rights were taken little by little. The regime took away your rights, and you didn't know it until they were gone, until you look back and you suddenly realize, oh, look, now we don't have any rights. This is an autocratic dictator or whatever they use. So this freshman said, or sophomore said, it's May 2022. Supreme Court in the US is considering reversing Roe v. Wade. And my friends and I are all concerned that this is a right that we've had all our lives that's about being taken away. Is this similar to what you're talking about? And they all went silent. They looked at each other, and every single one of them from Nicaragua and Venezuela said, yep, that's exactly what we remember happening. It was a small thing, nobody objected. Then another small thing happened. Nobody objected, and then another small thing happened. So I find that striking because here in the US, we're of course reading the news daily about rights being taken away. There's, we're safely here in Massachusetts, and we hear every day about what Governor Ron DeSantis is doing down in Florida and taking away small rights or cracking down on certain freedoms. So it's concerning, and it's concerning because we probably won't see what's happened to our democracy until it's maybe not too late, but until way down the road in hindsight. And so I so appreciate that we started this off talking about elections and talking about voting and civic education, because I think that's it. I think that is the only thing we've got to sort of to protect ourselves from this. And I sort of joked about taking civics in 8th grade just to pass the test. But you know what? I can't claim to be an expert on civics in the U.S. I see what's happening around the world, and I can sort of hold the U.S. Process up to that as a lens and spot some things. But frankly, I think a lot of us don't realize, and a lot of young people especially, but a lot of American voters or potential voters don't realize what we're under, how our democracy is under attack, or at least being pushed down on. Certainly, I would say that, coming back full circle, in my experience internationally, the area where I see the biggest gain is getting people to talk more effectively about the issues. And more effectively, as I say, as an example, is not talking about positions, but talking about the underlying interests. Listening skills, I can't tell you how much time I spend teaching governmental leaders how to listen. And listening is not the same as being quiet, as all of you know. But that's often how they approach it. As somebody said, listening in the US is a competitive sport. The person who stops talking first is declared the listener. So we have a lot to learn there. And then finally, I would say, in terms of the civic education, I think that we have to be able to teach people the importance of voting, but we also have to be able to teach these days the importance of accepting when you lose an election. And it's remarkable how that's something we learned on the playground also in middle school, but we just have lost sight of it. So thank you. I do want to get to the Q&A, and hopefully we'll dig in on some more.
Thank you so much. Full circle. Is this working? Yes? No? Yep. Brad, is this working? Is this, oh, now it's working, okay, yeah. Thank you. Anyway, now we've come full circle, haven't we, from our own youngsters to an international world where democracy is consistently imperiled. And I agree, Jim, that when somebody first said democracy is fragile, I thought, not here. And in such a short period of time, we've watched so many of the pillars of democracy crumble. So let's get to everybody's questions. And Fred, we also want to make sure if there are questions on the chat box that we get a chance to answer them. So Jim, you want to start?
So here in Concord, we often ignore the fact that in April 19th, 1775, we were an autocratic society. A small group of privileged people made most of the decisions. Capitalism and democracy have grown up together here over the last 250 years. I'd love to hear the points of view of the panel of under what conditions can capitalism thrive without democracy, and under what conditions can democracy thrive without capitalism?
Thank you for that extraordinary question. Who wants to take it? Danielle, you want to start us?
So, thank you. Is it Jim?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you for both the reminder of the historical context that we find ourselves in and for putting some of the hardest questions on the table. I like to remind people that the economy is not an end in itself. The point of a healthy economy is to support human flourishing. So that's where I always start. And for me, the question is, well, well, what's the picture of human flourishing? And I think we've heard it here when Shanique was telling her story about being at Senator Warren's event, and you said, the way I felt. And it reminded me of work I was doing with some teachers earlier this week, where it was clear everybody in the room was passionately committed to educating young people about democracy. But why? Why are we so passionately committed? And especially when we can see all the frustration, all the disappointment, the fact that actually understanding democracy is about accepting the fact that you lose competitions as well as winning them sometimes. So where the passion? And the teacher said, I had my kids writing, they were doing a project and they were writing to their representative, and they were getting so disappointed they weren't hearing anything back, and I was having to tell them, look, they're busy, there's a lot on their agenda, and literally as we were having this conversation, the email from the representative came back in, responding to my students' queries. So they jumped up for joy in the room. They literally jumped out of their chairs, they were so excited. And in that moment, she saw the same experience that Shanique was describing. That's what empowerment feels like. That's what it feels like to be seen. That's what it feels like to know that you can contribute to shaping the agenda for your community. So for me, that's the kind of content of human flourishing, and the economy should support that. So we need a healthy, dynamic, productive economy in support of the kind of flourishing that gives people empowerment.
Jim?
I might just add, I think that, I might want to ask folks a follow-up question, Jim, at some point, but I think the question that I'd love to dig in on is, when do we fail in protecting both capitalism or the economy? I love it, economic flourishing, even better. When do we sacrifice capitalism for democracy? When do we sacrifice democracy for capitalism? And I think one of the unfortunate things is we see internationally a lot of pariah states that are brought back into the fold simply because there's economic benefit to it, right? Or sometimes that there is a political benefit to it. So it would be great if it was more consistent. But I think that's part of the problem, is that we're inconsistent. And I should have said overall, we were talking about this at dinner, that overall, one of the biggest challenges internationally to U.S. struggling with this is that, like it or not, I think most of us kind of like it, we are a model. What happens here is going to happen elsewhere. People will point to the U.S. governments and say, well, it was okay when they did it, so it must be okay now. And we see that playing out, whether it's about capitalism overtaking democracy, or whether it's about democracies failing in and of themselves.
Yeah, it's such an important question, Jim, and the dynamic is so complicated, isn't it? Kate, you want to take it next? Here comes a microphone, please.
As many of you know, I'm involved with ranked choice voting, and it's a filter that I see everything through. And I certainly heard many echoes of that through what everybody was saying at the table. The idea of the tyranny of the minority oppressing the majority. So I guess my question, well, firstly, Concord passed ranked choice voting a year ago to use it municipally. And it has been sitting on Beacon Hill for the past year because they are not passing it. So we can't use it until they pass it. So taking this very large picture of everything that's wrong internationally, etc., this is something we can do in Massachusetts to make things better. So I'm wondering if you have any comments on how we as citizens can help put this across.
Shanique, that's right up your alley, isn't it?
Right. I think critically, when I think about the communities that I work in, the messaging on how it works is hard to grasp. And I was talking to Danielle's team about that as well, is that when we are a politically engaged body, we tend to think the way we think because we understand how things work. And we need to go back to the basics of just reminding people and telling people how things work in order to introduce new ideas about how things can work better. And so it's hard for me to talk about ranked choice voting in communities with people who did not even know an election was happening, did not know a ballot has changed or a district has changed, don't understand what they're electing a person to do, let alone the candidates who are running don't know what they're electing themselves to do. That is why the education piece and why I said that it's no longer about the parties and the lines. It's about how do we get people more involved and engaged to even approach this idea of ranked choice voting. It makes sense to me, but when I have conversations with my partner, my mother, who's a new voter, we have to think about these new voters too, right? The people who are naturalized and coming into this process and coming from countries like my own, where this process isn't even a real thing that we've ever seen. To try and introduce something that should be simple appears complicated, and I don't understand how it works, and then people shut down and don't want to engage in it. And that's exactly what's happening to elections in general. I don't understand how it works, and therefore I do not want to engage. And I don't trust anyone that's ever spoken to me about how it happens. So one of the things that I've named about ranked choice voting is we have to think about how do we go back to the basics of educating people about how our systems work now in order to create a messaging that works universally for everyone. And that's the trick about Fair Share campaign. It took us a decade to figure out how to message that in the right specific way, in the most simplest way, that everyone understood what that's like. We spent millions to do that. And it's just a reminder of that. That for me has been the core issue in community.
And you know, I think we just have to say that Concord is not a model in terms of having 100% voting. We are way behind ourselves, and so every effort we need to put forward to get our own citizens to vote is very important. Sir, right here, yes.
Thank you. Dr. Allen, I was very interested to hear everything you said, and I got excited because I knew you were going to say, one of the answers is ranked choice voting. And I don't think I heard that. And I know it's difficult to describe. I got 500 signatures for it to put it on the ballot. And it's not easy to describe to people in a way that they can understand. But I'd be very interested in your thoughts on ranked choice voting.
Sure, I appreciate that. Please do call me Danielle. Feel free. Appreciate the doctor, but Danielle is good.
Yes, she is.
But, well, and Kate, always wonderful to see you, and love your beautiful button. I should wear my button. So I didn't explicitly mention ranked choice voting, but the electoral system that I briefly pointed you toward, a top 4 or top 5 system, is in the second and final round a ranked choice voting vote. So it's a hybrid system. In the all-comers preliminary, it's a plurality, in the same way in the Boston mayor's race, you've got a load of candidates and then you take 2 forward based on the 2 top vote getters. Springfield's got a mayor's race right now. How many candidates do you guys have in it?
We now have 4.
4 candidates, exactly. So a good competitive election, and they'll take the top 2 forward in the final round. The advantage of taking more candidates for those statewide and federal races, you can expect more candidates. And then if you take the top 4 or 5 forward, you can use an instant runoff in the general. So then you have, in the preliminary, a chance for real diversity of perspective. You can have third parties, Green Party, Independents, Working Families Party, for example, candidates can be on the ballot with Democrats and Republicans all in one context. That's really important because that's the moment where you get media attention on the conversation. And coming to the education point, the education we get as citizens really depends on the structure of our elections, actually. So if you want more voices helping to shape the conversation, a richer debate that will engage more people because there's more contrast and the like, you get that with that all-comers preliminary. And then going on to the final round, the ranked choice voting element, where if you've got 4 going forward or 5, you knock the bottom one out, their voters all have their votes going to their second choice person until somebody gets over the 50% line. That way you ensure that whoever wins has gotten past that 50% line. And I'll tell you guys one other little thing. This is because as you know, I'm a nerd, okay? So when things bug me conceptually, I do a little digging, I do research. And I think that has always bugged me is this first past the post phrase that we use for plurality elections. Have you ever thought about that phrase? First past the post, that suggests a fixed point, doesn't it? As the first to get past it? Well, that phrase, when it was first used, was in Australia in the context of elections where you had to get past 50%. That's what it's actually supposed to mean, for the obvious reason that you really do want people elected on the basis of a majority. So at any rate, the instant runoff method gives us the real meaning of first past the post, past 50%.
And just for your edification, when Danielle was here about a couple years ago, I said, well, if I gave you a magic wand, you could change one thing, what would it be? And she said, ranked choice voting, let's get it. So, I mean, she's right there.
Diane, we have a
yes.
question.
Oh, good, Fred.
Yeah, Republicans are now at the point where they claim widespread fraud every time they lose an election. How do we convince people to stop believing things when there is no evidence?
Oh, yeah. Who wants to take that?
International conflict mediation.
I see why it was put at the end of the table, so if you could just point that way, everything rolls downhill. Couple quick thoughts about that. First of all, absolutely, the truth matters in democracy, and the truth and the facts are critically important. We're in a bizarre time right now where our political leaders have become very comfortable saying untruths, misrepresenting the truth strategically, without any hesitation, right? And I think in most of our lifetimes that was a major hurdle to go over, right? If somebody lied, we all remember Richard Nixon got impeached because he lied, and then various other politicians did as well. But today it's just, okay, it's fine. You know, and our media leaders, it's fine. Nobody calls them on it. So there's a problem in how we get our truth nowadays, how we get our facts nowadays. And I'm not pointing just at the media. I actually feel this is one of those times where, as somebody in Guatemala helped me understand, when you point at somebody else, you have three fingers pointing back at yourself. The three fingers in this case are that we allow it to happen. We keep buying the media, we keep watching it, and no matter what media you listen to, you are getting a perspective on the truth. People in real life don't tend to fight about the truth, like actual facts. Nobody in here is going to fight about whether there's oxygen in this room. You might argue about whether the oxygen is too stuffy, or too cold, or your perspective on that fact. But most actual fights are not about the facts, they're about perspectives. Unfortunately, we've entered a period where a lot of our leaders are confusing those two. And leaders, meaning anybody who has a microphone, including me, this is my perspective, is messing with that truth, that it's hard to get at the truth. Now, coming back to my main point, and I think what you were saying is truth does matter, and we can't make good decisions in elections or in democracies without at least knowing what is and is not. And that's gotten very fuzzy recently. So we've got a lot of work there.
We sure do, didn't
Thank you. I'm going to borrow a page out of Kate's book and ask you a question that also allows me to advocate for what I'm working on. My name is Vivian Sang with CARE, Coalition for Anti-Racism and Equity in Education. And we're advocating for a state bill that would provide for racially inclusive education in the public school K through 12 curriculum. So my question to you is, can you have real effective civic education without a racially inclusive ethnic studies type of education in our public schools?
Could you all hear that question? Yes, okay, thank you so much. Who wants to take this?
Was that directed? Oh, yeah. Or do you have something you want to say? I don't want to jump in. I'm sure you have a lot to say, but well, thank you. And for starters, just really thank you for working on behalf of kids and working on behalf of kids having the chance to have a complete education. So that's important. I always tell the story about when I was a kid. I used to ask my teachers, what was like life for people who were enslaved and things like that. And they would say, well, we don't know, they know, we can't know, they didn't write, they didn't leave enough records and so forth. And my teachers were well-meaning, well-intentioned people, and that was the best of their understanding. And it's been a great joy of my lifetime that in my 50 plus years on the planet, historians have transformed our knowledge base. And that's just one very specific example, but there's a heck of a lot to teach kids at this point about, in the voices of people who were enslaved themselves, what the experience was like, what they learned, how they overcame it, how they survived it, and so forth. So there's just amazingly rich teaching materials, and I'm very proud of a unit that we co-designed with Cambridge Public Schools for grade 5, which is about abolition, actually. Is a part about enslavement, part about abolition. And the primary sources are entirely in the voices of people who were enslaved or were fighting for abolition. Anyway, this is a very long-winded way of saying that there's a lot of great work out there. I'm proud to be part of something called the Educating for American Democracy Roadmap Project. And I would really encourage you to take a look at it, because I think you'll find in it a good sort of framework for inclusivity in education. And I would be grateful for your feedback on it, and we're always looking for people to help advance that as a part of the solution.
Shani.
Yeah, I love that you are advocating for that, and I was just thinking why I paused before answering, is it just about how nationally that has become very political? And I just thought about just my experience in American education, being new to this country, wanting to understand this country as a whole, and only learning pieces of history. And then getting to a point in life where I could opt to take, world history, or get to college and take constitutional history. And I remember thinking at those points how I wish those were a part of the fundamentals of what I learned in an elementary school. I think it's very American, and I'll say that not wearing my naturalized hat on, to only think about the perspective that you have as an American without seeing the perspectives of others who live in America and who live in other places that isn't America. And I find that some of the most closed off conversations I've had are people who have not taken the time to understand other people's history, their cultures, and how they show up in the space. And that's so important when we're trying to relate to other human beings, and when we're trying to even engage in a process of elections or talking about policy, is that we have to understand, how people fundamentally came to be who they are historically and as human beings. And I think that it's a disservice to children if we tell them this perspective that this is the only thing that exists in the world, and this is the only way that you can function in the world, not telling them that other people have experienced life differently, or other places and cultures see the world differently, right? Just looking at Paris and how there was an all-out riot about changing the retirement age, right? I didn't even know that was now everyone's retiring at 65. That was news for me, but I loved the passion, and it taught us all something, right? About a whole other country and how their systems work, and fundamentally how an entire country thinks about retirement, right? And so I think that that's so important. And I've enjoyed learning the history of America. I've enjoyed learning Black history from the perspective of Black Americans. And I want to see that more in education, because I think it makes well-rounded human beings. And it's the things that you remember a lot. I don't remember much about algebra. I'm sure I use it. But people, cultures, people, places, and things, I will remember. And I think that that is really helpful as a growth of young people today.
Thank you for the gorgeous, unfortunately, timing is so sharp, but let's take 2 more questions and so I'm gonna go back here first and then we'll come up here, okay? So, thank you.
I just first I want to thank you for the word affluential. That's just really going to sit with me for a little bit. But what I wanted to ask you, I mean, do you understand how easy it is for us to vote? We just drive to our polling place 1 or 2 miles from our house. If it takes us 5 minutes, you know, if there's anyone in front of us, it's like, oh, I have to wait. And yet I have friends who have moved into the city. And when you talk about equal voting rights, is there some kind of law or any kind of expectation that we can have that says it should not take more than 25 minutes to vote? And I hear of people who have to wait for 3 hours to vote. I'm not sure I would wait for 3 hours to vote. So is there anything that can be done about that equal right to the ballot box in terms of waiting time?
And then we hear in Georgia that you're not allowed to bring water, remember? And, you know, and all the other constraints if they've managed to have you wait a very long time.
I haven't known of one that's come up in Massachusetts now, but Danielle, you can tell me if I'm wrong. I am a part of the Massachusetts Voter Table is part of the Election Modernization Coalition, in which it's a coalition of organizations that's really about modernizing the election process. Most notably passed the Votes Act that gave us permanent mail-in voting options and attempted to do same-day voter registration. I think that that is just another piece of what we're having conversations about. But there are these other things where we are one of the few states that have same-day voter registration, even though most most New England states have it. We can't get that passed for whatever reason in the state house. It's become super politicized. And there's a lot of right-wing antics coming into sort of the politicizing that about how valid, you know, the vote is, if people can just come in and register the same day. Nonsense. We're now working on a part 2 of the Votes Act, which is going to make sure that we work on having more access to the ballot box as well. What we are having issues with is people who are in transient communities being dropped from voter rolls, municipal. We're working on trying to decouple the municipal census from the actual your voter registration. There's a lot of history in that, and I will be happy to talk to you about why that is a problem in America and in Massachusetts as a whole. But the fact that you can just fall off of the active voter list because you didn't fill out a municipal census is a problem that people face. But I think that we are in conversation about that aspect. We're just trying to solve these other things that make voting actually easier for people when they arrive. And then there's also just the issues with transportation within regions and communities. And that is separate from what you're asking, but is tied to it, right? We always find that there are intersections of issues, and transportation is the biggest reason why people don't show up to a polling location, especially in larger cities, and especially if you're low income and don't have a car. All of those things is having that issue, and might also lend to why there are longer lines, because if we're all taking a bus to the poll, we're all arriving at the same time as well. And then also about when people have time to vote. That's another thing in conversation, is about the times and when people can vote, and how do we look at that differently.
I want to lift up one thing that Shanique said there, same-day voter registration. That's the thing folks are ready to ask for help on getting done. And as Shanique said, it's been stuck in the legislature, so the odds of this needing to be a ballot initiative are very, very high. So, and why do things get stuck in the legislature? Because we don't have an accountability mechanism for our legislature, because we don't have very many contested elections. Which brings me back to my top 4, top 5 election mechanism with the all-comers preliminary. Get more candidates into the mix. That way, you start to rebuild an accountability mechanism, get your legislature operating again. But along the path to that kind of democracy renovation, same-day voter registration is another key piece of what we need.
Thank you. Jim?
And just really quickly, the counterbalance to making it easier, of course, is what we witnessed certainly with the Dominion voting system that was supposed to make it all easier and mail-in ballots. I just came from a deep discussion with Venezuelans 2 weeks ago where they were talking about, yes, we want to be able to use our fingerprint to validate our vote. But what happens if somebody in the government wants to match our fingerprint with how we voted? And will that impact our services? So there are all these trade-offs that we're struggling with ethically around voting, which I find bizarre. We should just be able to vote. I agree with you, Loretta. It should be easy, it should be quick, it should be durable.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question.
Start with a quick apology. Ma'am from Ukraine, would you remind me of your name again, please? Arena, your story, the part of your story that really hit me was the moment when Ukraine no longer had Russian propaganda. And your people, your fellow country people, were able to retake their own history and retake reality. And I ask this because it is a fact that our country is under propaganda attack. The messaging that is twisting and perverting reality for so many of my country people is not an accident and is not kind of like sort of happened. There are people that have been planning and working on this for decades, and both sides do it. I've been watching it since the 1980s, and it terrifies me. And I wondered if there are any stories, any thoughts from that time period when your country people took back their reality that maybe you could share. Is there anything that we could use to start attacking and bringing back our country? I've just spent a ton of time in South Central Pennsylvania, which is different from Concord, people. The people there, our country people are not evil. They really believe. My brother was frantic when my daughter went to visit San Francisco because Fox News told him it was this hellish place where people were getting gunned down. He worries about me here because it's so dangerous. He lives in York, Pennsylvania. It is not a different place. Our fellow country people are being made terrified of our cities, and they're given completely wrong information about what is actually happening in our country. And I'm looking for ways that we can retake reality.
Thank you. Such a wonderful question.
That's a very loaded question. Ukrainians were under siege for hundreds and hundreds of years. This is a new phenomenon here in the United States. That's a very big difference. But to wake up in Ukraine and have to start thinking about who you are, where you're gonna go, nobody's telling you what to do anymore, like under the Soviets, and you have to share the responsibility for your actions and for your future. That's scary. That's what we were seeing in the 1990s when people had to wake up. And I think Americans have to wake up. I think that they have started to fall asleep. And that's why the right sector is gaining ground, because people are sleeping. Then they can't do that. They have to fight for what they believe in, and if they see, now, another thing, the Russians have been lying to their people forever and ever. everything that the government says is a lie for their own purposes, for their own selfish purposes, and to stay in power. That's what's happening here. To stay in power, people are lying and making up stories and fantasizing, and you just can't sit back and take it. If you know that that is not true. And I think that people have to start waking up. That's it.
Thank you so much. So, wake up, right? What an extraordinary evening. George Washington, in a letter to Alexander Hamilton, presciently noted that differences in political opinions are as unavoidable as, to a certain point, they may be necessary. It is to be regretted, he wrote, exceedingly, that subjects cannot be discussed with temper on one hand, or decisions submitted to without having the motives which led to them improperly implicated on the other. And this regret borders on chagrin, Washington said, when we meet men, when we find that men of abilities, zealous patriots, having the same general objects in view and the same upright intentions to prosecute them, will not exercise more charity in deciding on the opinions and actions of one another. He should have been here this evening to hear our collective resolutions and deliberations. As we embark on this grand celebration tomorrow, let us graciously embrace our differences, enjoy finding Concord, and leave here this evening with determined optimism in our hearts. Thank you all for joining us.